So, hello everybody. Welcome to another XSCALE Alliance podcast. I'm joined by Francis Liu and Peter Merrill. My name is Stefan Wolpers, and today we're going to have the second part of our ecosystem thinking we started last week. Okay, gentlemen, who would like to give a brief introduction to what we did last time?
I'm thinking I could whiz through the slides we used last time real quick, and that'll be a recap, and then we'll pick it up where we left off.
Perfect. Let's go.
Okay, so ecosystems thinking. We have several influences in this. Last time we talked about this idea of ecosystems as networks of mutual benefit. We told the story about the farmer who won the best ear of corn 20 years in a row by providing his neighbors with his best seeds, and of course their plants pollinized his. We're looking at industrial agriculture, and the closer we look at it, the less sense it seems to make. We made an analogy with the ownership relationships between 35 million companies worldwide, and we came to understand how the structure of those ownership relationships resembles this disgusting quagmire in the middle of these cattle yards in the middle of a lot of industrial agricultural fields. So then we used Game of Go as a metaphor for an ecosystem, so we could understand how stones of the same color relate to each other through networks of mutual benefit. And in doing that, we began to understand something about how to go about designing an ecosystem. And that's to put one of our main cultural references into context, which is to say permaculture, which provides us with 12 design principles for sustainable ecosystems. The trouble with those principles is they aren't very close to what we're used to dealing with in the corporate world. So in order to approach them, we gave an example to do with the design of iPhone as an ecosystem. We're used to thinking of it as a device, but it is, of course, a channel to a huge range of Apple services, and it's embedded in those services. You acquire iPhones through those services. So we looked at how the space of different ecosystem designs is not flat and is not static. We came to understand how the way we approach this ecosystem depends on the pirate metrics. So in applying those metrics, which we've dealt with in detail in the Pirate Canvas in podcasts past, we're eliminating parts of the space of all possible ecosystems. And the example with iPhone was all about taking iPhone out of the big box stores first, before Apple even attempted to bring any of its services to market. And that might seem like a marketing choice, but the design of Apple stores, the retail glass and steel Apple stores, was an astonishing engineering undertaking that required a great deal of very focused design activity. So starting with ecosystem and then moving to experience design and device design and program design and so on, that breadth first design activity is key to ecosystems thinking. And we will see how that shows up in the permaculture world in just a little bit. So not to put too fine a point on the different distinctions that go into designing the iPhone ecosystem, we were able to narrow down the region of the overall design space, breadth first, whole board thinking, to be able to understand exactly what iPhone as a linchpin in an ecosystem needed to be. And from that understanding, we're then able to derive the constraints for experience design, program design, all of the hardware design, the business architecture, and so on. So from this view, we generalize by looking at a diagram of a permaculture farm. Permaculture is a discipline that was evolved by two Australian environmentalists, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. Mollison passed away in 2016. Holmgren is still very much alive. And in the last week, he's given us some lovely feedback on this idea of ecosystems thinking. But you'll see this farm looks very, very different to what we were looking at before. There's none of the higgledy-piggledy. There's a lot of deep structure to this. And the farm works with the constraints of the terrain and the climate. It works with the constraints of relationships between different kinds of species. It tries to optimize the throughput for all these species because there is synergy between them. One of the items we glossed over last time, this idea of synergies between organisms, comes from, this is an idea that's in permaculture, comes from American Indian culture, from the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, who we touched on when we looked at Game Without Thrones. This is not a wandering people. They're not nomads doing hunting and collecting. They lived for several centuries in very sustainable, settled agricultural settlements built out of wood, but surrounded by fields that they farmed. Their farming patterns, though, were very different to what we're used to. Instead of having one crop in one field and another crop in another field, they would plant them together to be able to maximize the yield. And the pattern that they are best known for, the three sisters, which is to say corn and squash and beans. They would plant these together. They would plant the corn 3 days before the other two, but they would plant them in exactly the same place. So what would happen is the corn would sprout, and 3 days after, the squash would start. Now, squash grows much faster, at least initially, than corn. It has very broad leaves that are full of natural pesticides and natural anti-pest pheromones and so on. So the effect is that the squash guards the corn seedlings, which would otherwise be picked off by the birds and infested with various kinds of parasites. And the corn eventually grows above the level of the nice, shady squash leaves. Now, around about that time, the beans, which are a vine, start climbing up the corn stalks. And so the yield you get from planting these three sisters together is much greater than if you plant any of them independently. And even better, though perhaps the Haudenosaunee were not so aware of this when they came up with this pattern, those three plants have the combination, the desirable combination effect of enriching the soil in which they grow, so you don't get soil erosion. They fix nitrogen, amongst other things. So there are many different combinations of plants. They call it syntropic farming that do this, but let's forget about farms. Let's think about business. That's, after all, the kind of thing that we're interested in when it comes to ecosystems thinking. So let's see, Francis is sending me a message. Francis, why don't you jump in?
Well, I was thinking that is ecosystem thinking, and the nature of many organizations is not to support all three sorts of vegetables. They only want to support the winner.
Yeah.
And they understand that if they don't have all three kinds, the winner won't grow as grandly, but then they're not going to waste money on the other two.
Mm-hmm. It's siloed thinking. It also opposes cross-functional feature teams.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, but there's part of it. Part of it is around the cross-functionality, but part of it's also around the product mix. How do you build sacrificial product?
You would need to be able to experiment. So that brings us to the principles of permaculture. These are design principles for farms like this. But what we're doing with ecosystems thinking, we're drawing on Go, we're drawing on permaculture. And what we're trying to do with this kind of thinking is give it to our clients in a concrete form that we can represent in terms of metrics. We have to be able to measure things to be able to optimize them. So just the principles by themselves, it's not quite enough. Nevertheless, what we're going to talk about today is both the permaculture principles and how they can be adapted to describe an agile organization, by which I mean an organization that is founded on an ecosystem, a learning ecosystem. So if we think an ecosystem is a network of mutual benefit, then the kind of benefit we're looking for here is the acceleration of learning in the organization. Now, many people listening might go, wait a second, organizations don't need to learn. Organizations need to minimize costs and maximize profits. In order to be able to do those things, to minimize costs and maximize profits, or more to the point, sometimes you don't want to minimize costs. And we looked at this when we looked at throughput accounting a couple of podcasts ago. What we really want is to maximize throughput. And if we have to spend money to be able to generate the capability to generate throughput, well, then that's a kind of learning that most organizations don't do. So let's move on, at least let's move away from farms, because last time we covered the first 6 permaculture principles. So I'm just going to give a summary of our adaptation of these to large human organizations. Since we talked about them in depth last time, anyone who's particularly interested in that, please go and consult the previous podcast/webinar. So, observe and interact. Business, design, and technical stakeholders must work face-to-face as peers to design solutions that fit each other's constraints. I should say, any of the panelists who want to jump in, if you've had further thoughts during the week, please do. No, actually, I don't know if we've really talked about which panelists are online at the moment. Right now, there's just the 4 of us. We might get Mel Kendall a bit later on. I was talking with her earlier in the day.
Mel has joined us. Hi, Mel.
Oh, she has?
Yeah.
Oh, she's just as an attendee, I think.
Yeah.
You might need to promote her.
Mel, you can join the discussion anytime.
Oh, okay, cool.
I think.
Oh, perfect. All right, then. So anyway, if you guys have anything where you'd like to hold me up short on any of the stuff, including stuff we covered last time, please do. So, observe and interact. Business design and technical stakeholders must work face-to-face as peers to design solutions that fit each other's constraints. This, of course, goes to the original agile principle about the best way to communicate to and within teams, and several of the ideas we talked about when we had the Game Without Thrones podcast. Second one, capture and store learning in small, self-organizing, cross-functional teams. As these satisfy current constraints, they become capable of breaking through future bottlenecks. I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with Robert Falkowitz, who's done quite a lot of work in this area. And he was observing that many organizations spend a great deal of time and money populating knowledge management systems. And in his experience, there's dubious return on doing that because, of course, the learning has to be embodied in human conversations in stable teams. Without doing that, you're basically expecting everybody to rediscover the learning over and over and over again. It's very difficult for it to be activated that way. So I shall move on to the third one of these. Obtain a yield. Each team must measure its contribution to top-line business throughput as the result of the work it's doing. We're used to, in the Agile world, talking about velocity rather than top-line business throughput, which takes this Goldratt definition of if you remove the truly variable costs, which includes waste and all the other things you don't want, interest rates and keeping the lights on, all of the things you can't control through intentional work. If you remove those, then the remaining operating expense is actually good because it funds the capability to generate net profit. If you add that operating expense and net profit together, that's what Goldratt called throughput, and that's what this is referring to. But more to the point, we're not used to the idea that teams have to measure their contribution to top-line business throughput. We're trying to increase velocity, which contributes to productivity, or so we're told. But if we can't actually sell the features that are being developed by these teams, then it's not productivity, it's waste.
No, Peter, I'm guessing that the existing Scrum practice has gone down this velocity route because it hasn't been, the existing practices aren't very strong on the role of product owners in this particular way of top-line business throughput. So there's only this question of prioritization. And because it's an unqualified prioritization, the prioritization that occurs is based on velocity, because it's unstated. That's an assumption that seems to have gone in. So
I think that there is
that perspective, it will help.
There is an aspiration to do ROI-based prioritization, but the trouble is most product owners, because of the nature of the role, and we've talked about this in past podcasts too, are not very eager to reprioritize based on learning to do with market analytics, because the work that they have to do to align many different kinds of stakeholders to account for that stuff is very, very hard. They're not given the tools they need to be able to do it. That's where that very first principle about business and design and technical stakeholders working together face to face is critical. And that means that product owners need to move into a pure servant leader role. And that's where we are in the game without thrones.
Even if it's just the one above it, that just because of the proximity of that principle,
yes.
if their focus is on truly useful rewards, it won't just be on velocity.
Yes, exactly right. Okay, shall we move on? Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Align teams into self-managing value streams that continuously adapt their work priorities to changing market feedback, which is what we were just talking about. Next one. Share resources and services across streams. Motivate mutual benefit across teams and streams to reduce silos, dependencies, and missed opportunities. Now, if you caught our podcast on agile game theory, where we looked at the tragedy of the PMO and the open book management single P&L remedy of the PMO, that's really where this idea of motivating mutual benefit comes from. We need people to be motivated to share learning and to collaborate across teams and streams. Because if they're not motivated to do it, it doesn't matter what organization structure we put together, no learning will flow through it. I'm going to assume that no one has a comment on that. Cool. All right. And then the last one we covered last time, mercilessly refactor value streams. Reuse, recycle, or reduce all the resources a stream produces until nothing goes to waste. Now, we made a change in some of the wording we were using. We've basically changed from all the outputs to all the resources, because the use of that word is really important. If we think of the things that we are producing as resources, then we naturally will try to make use of them. If we just think of them as outputs, whether the outputs are defects or whether they are waste heat, or no matter how we structure our value stream, if they are regarded as outputs, then we can think, oh, well, gee, that's a bit of a problem. Somebody else can solve that. That's not a big deal. But we talked about last time about how Swedish factories, the waste heat in the exhaust gases from Swedish factories is being used to heat facilities, I think including homes, in the wintertime. So that's making use of that waste heat as a resource. In the software realm, people talk about automation as if it was something that Agile invented. But programmers have been automating their tests ever since there were programmers. The difference is they threw them away. There were no frameworks within which they could capture those tests. As far as they were concerned, it was a one-time test, and it told them that the program was doing what they expected, and then they could chuck it. So keeping them around and lifting them up a level using the BDD techniques so that we can assure our analysts and our business stakeholders that not just the code is doing what the programmer thinks, but the system behavior is doing what they expect. It's actually solving the business problems that they are attacking. Being able to maintain that assurance as a constraint, no matter how we change the code going forward. Sometimes we have to refactor the tests because the constraints change. Nevertheless, it's enormously valuable. It means that we are balanced and ready for any kind of new requirement, but we know we can adapt to it without breaking all of the features that we delivered previously. So if there was one thing on the technical side that the early days of Agile got right, it was that idea of test-driven and now behavior-driven development. And that goes to this principle. Previously, we simply weren't reusing, much less, I guess the distinction should be made as well. Recycling is taking the wastes and finding ways to process them so that they are then feedstock for value, where reuse is simply trying to use again, and then reducing, well, what we would like to do with the code base, and hiking back to the code refactoring example, but this also goes for value streams. What we would like to do, in the lean sense as well, is we would like to take any of the resources that they are producing that are not being used, that we can't find a customer for, and pare them away as much as possible. So that's just about the soul of lean thinking. Anyone got any comments on this bit? Why not shall we move on to new stuff?
Good idea.
Let's keep going.
Okay, so here we are, number 7. The permaculture principle is design from patterns to details. By stepping back, we can observe patterns in nature and society. These can form the backbone of our designs, with the details filled in as we go. So what we've made of this, it's very commonplace, both in change programs and delivery programs, that we design depth first. We go all the way down to the details, we try to get those sorted out. And then once we've taken care of those, we can take a head out of one spec and try to figure out, all right, now what are we going to do in the next spec? And we'll burrow down that way. The trouble with that approach is it creates enormous gaps between the specifications, and we don't discover those gaps until later on. And suddenly we have to account for them with change requests. And sometimes it turns out that our architecture is invalid because we didn't think breadth first. So the example we gave about designing iPhone as an ecosystem is a nice way to think about this breadth first approach. Step back to see patterns in and between markets and value streams. We have the metaphor of markets as nature. Now, obviously, we're not usually thinking about the rest of the biosphere as a market, which is a shame because it means that we don't have a way to monetize life cycles that are critical to our own survival. And without monetizing them, you bet we're not going to try and sustain them. So, but the relationships between markets and the value streams in our organizations, those patterns are critical as well, as they form skeletons of designs that we can detail as we learn more. So basically we're filling in these skeletons with more skeletons. We're iterating, but first we have to make certain that the places we're iterating are the most bang for the buck. We don't want to go and do detailed design on things that we're never going to need to market. So this is of the old XP principle of Yagni. You aren't going to need it. You either need it now, in which case do it now, or don't do it now. If you're going to need it later on, then do it later on. That means that the cost of change is dramatically reduced, and costs of quality and maintenance are as well. So it's a lot of what makes Agile in IT agile. Okay, I'm out of breath on this one.
I think that Okay, you go first, Stefan.
I was okay. Nothing from my side. Totally agree.
I was going to say, Peter, I was going to say that there's an exhortation and an understanding that the autonomous team is, one, allowed to, and two, capable of stepping back and seeing the market and value streams. And there may be a transition for many organizations to be able to reach this goal. Once they've got that larger scope of visibility and they're not just looking in the code itself, then this is the place they're going to.
Mm-hmm. I agree, but I think that your concern, though, is a bit deeper, because an individual small autonomous team might not have the perspective it needs to be able to see these patterns. And that means we're going to need to be able to introduce members of multiple teams to each other. And this is where the Game of Thrones set of patterns, or Game Without Thrones set of patterns, comes in, because it means that we can work face to face with the business and design stakeholders to be able to understand these patterns, the relationships and the constraints. Do you feel that fully satisfies your concern, or is there more?
I'm absolutely agreeing with you. It's as a set of principles, I think it's excellent. It's a place where people are aiming to get to.
Yes. Well, that one then goes to the 7 Samurai Kanban that we did in the second XSCALE Alliance podcast, where we basically apply this same idea to change programs and the ability to deliver the highest return on investment change features, and to do this systematically. That's kind of presupposed in most of XSCALE. I guess it echoes the idea of the small holding, human intensive permaculture farms. If we can create a working end-to-end value stream, business on the front end, then design, delivery, DevOps, all working hand in glove, a slender value stream with just a few people involved, maybe a dozen, maybe 20, prove that it works, and then grow it, we have a much easier way of generating a new form for the organization than if we try to push culture into the existing teams and streams. So that means that we don't have to compromise. We can start with the most progressive people in the organization. Now, does that mean we're violating this principle? Not really, because we map the change program breadth first, but we deliver it incrementally, one feature at a time, same as we would do in a delivery stream. Any better?
Excellent.
Okay, cool. So, is everybody okay for me to move on?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, the permaculture principle, integrate rather than segregate. By putting the right things in the right place, relationships develop between those things and they work together to support each other. It's a beautiful sentiment. What do we do with it? Collaborate rather than delegate. The right people are in the right relationships when conversations develop between them, so they work together and support each other. I think this is the principle that has the strongest one-to-one correspondence in language. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, Agile began with the idea of we want teams to effectively collaborate. So in an Agile organization, we try to minimize delegation. That's not to say we don't want directly responsible individuals. We do. But where they need to coordinate and align, that's where they need to bring their responsibilities together face to face. And the conversation between them needs to be orderly. This is where the leadership as a service patterns live. So when the right conversations develop so that they are working together and supporting each other, well, then you have the same kind of close trust relationships and high cadence, which is to say frequent feedback, and motivations in the reward model for maintaining those things and metrics for those things that enable your organization to stay balanced and ready to embrace change. Anybody got anything on this one?
Nope.
All good.
Good to go.
All right. Permaculture Principle number 9. There are only 12 of these, so don't feel like we're going to spend forever listing things. Use small and slow solutions. Small and slow systems are easier to maintain than big ones, making better use of local resources and producing more sustainable outcomes. Wow, this is hard to sell. How can we tell organizations that they have to slow down to speed up? In teams, I think most of us are aware of that principle. But in looking at this advice, it's impossible to sell to the C-suite. And what's more, we don't really need to, because we started to read about what the slow means here. And it has to do with systems that will maintain themselves over time without requiring constant rapid interventions. So for most of what we think about in the agile world, that has to do with automation. Hence, take the time to simplify and automate solutions. Simple automated systems are easier to maintain than big manual ones, taking less work to make more useful outcomes. Now, this principle has been absolutely fundamental to agile since the early XP days. Now, some people trace agile back to lean. I tend to think of these things as different. Certainly in terms of the lineage of the ideas, they were very distinct to begin with. People talk about the initial Scrum paper and the new product development, I think it was, system. But to tell the truth, if you go and look at that original paper, it has almost nothing to do with Scrum as we know it today. It talks about sprints. But it doesn't have any of the activities that we think about in Scrum today. XP has all of them and then more. So I tend to think of XP as the mainstream and Scrum as a little bit of a marketing representation of the parts of XP that you can get away with in a siloed waterfall culture. The idea here is we're not in a siloed waterfall culture. We're trying to build an uncompromised agile organization. So taking the time to simplify and automate is a matter of maximizing throughput, not trying to minimize operating expense. If you're constantly cutting things to the bone, you can't take the time to simplify and automate. And what happens there is you build up technical debt and organizational debt until the interest on it crushes your ability to deliver value. We looked at this in the Agile Game Theory podcast. So there's one more thing I want to say on this one. That last part, taking less work to make more useful outcomes. Well, we have a couple of people, leading lights, you would think, in the Agile community, who've been saying things that sound a bit like that. In particular, there's a book, Producing Twice the Work in Half the Time. It goes back to the Scrum leading lights. Well, the trouble with the book is that, I like that little cough there. That's what most Agilists did when they heard that book title. Some of them thought it was a bit of a joke, but it's not a joke. Unfortunately, it's also not true. You can try producing twice the work in half the time, but if you don't put in place the simplification and automation practices you need to continuously pay down your technical debt, you will very rapidly come to a place where you are producing half the work in twice the time, and it'll get worse than that. So there is no panacea in Scrum. To tell the truth, there's no panacea in anything. We have to be able to continuously learn and simplify and automate to be able to get the bang for the buck in doing this work. Hence, taking less work to make more useful outcomes hinges on simplification and automation. What do you guys reckon?
And saying no. I mean, I think the magic, we all have this iconic red cover in front of us. And I always think, thank you, Jeff, that was really great. Now all the bean counters know how Scrum works. And that's why they are so after velocity and all this bullshit. What they don't take into account is that the productivity of the team indeed increases, but not just by becoming more efficient, but saying more often no to things that don't provide value, right? Which means that you have to figure out what actually is contributing to the top line revenue, and as early as possible. That means that you actually have to go in full XP to make this work, right? So keeping technical debt at bay, thinking about having slack time included in every sprint, and paying down technical debt as well. And then it's a completely different picture, you know. But the subtitle of that book would take several pages, right? And unfortunately, the folks in the management part do not read that long subtitles, in my experience.
Sound bites.
It's basically the difference between efficiency and effectiveness.
Quite so. So, Mel, when you think about that distinction, is there a specific example that's coming to mind?
Well, efficiency is about doing things leaner and faster, but effectiveness also has direction. And this is the bit that people don't get in Agile about velocity, is velocity has direction. Speed doesn't have direction.
Yes. So if we don't have a clear picture of the relationship between the business drivers and constraints and the prioritization of the work, then that direction is going to be snafu. Yeah. So this principle, it's not just XP, it also goes to business agility. Because when it comes to the way we interact with the market and the way we construct value streams, if we can build these things so they maintain themselves, which is what we mean by automation, then we can focus on other things. But if we have to constantly do paperwork and meetings and manual conversations, whether with our customers or with each other, to make things happen, nothing is simple, and we get mired in the details. So from a business agility perspective, the more useful outcomes is that, well, once things are automated, we're able to generalize them. And this has been the path that Amazon has gone down. They started as a retail service, as a bookseller, a bookselling company, but they realized that the automation that they had put together to be able to support their work was actually more valuable than their entire retail enterprise. So taking the time, that one also goes to the idea of recycling or reusing resources, because the interfaces that they built to be able to do that were resources that weren't being used for anybody's business except for Amazon's. Once they made them available through their cloud services, then they became far more profitable than all of the book selling in the world.
I think there's a very solid and direct mapping here for many organizations. If they look at Amazon or Google or Facebook or any of the big tech companies that many organizations look to for leadership in this space, you see that they haven't built one horrendously huge system. It's very clear at a consumer level that there's many separate products that may or may not be related, and the organization hangs together and make lots of money. And then that's the bit they seem to not be taking back into their own organization.
Yeah. I think we have some principles coming up that go to that as well, but that factoring into little self-contained tools that can be plugged together and generalized and adapted for many purposes. That's kind of goes to that principle about reusing and recycling and so on. Okay, for us to move on?
Let's move on.
Okay. So the 10th, the third last, third last, the penultimate permaculture principle: use and value diversity. Diversity reduces vulnerability to a variety of threats and takes advantage of the unique nature of the environment in which it resides. The variety of threats is awfully vague, and the vulnerability was very difficult for us to pin down. We had to pour a good amount of skull sweat into this one to understand how to apply it in a corporate context. But actually, it's really neat because if we start to think about experimentation as generating value or reducing risk and adapting the product to the market, well, this is about diversity of approach. And that diverse approach can be pursued by various different teams and various different streams in parallel. So this brings us into the ideas of set-based design and set-based concurrent engineering that we covered when we were looking at our product management practice patterns in that podcast. So use and value experimentation. Experiment to reduce risk and adapt each product to the unique constraints of your organization and its markets. Well, in many organizations, experimentation is impossible because you are supposed to get it right the first time. Otherwise, your bonus is at risk. If we were to permit people to fail, they might waste our money. We're paying them to achieve results. And that kind of mentality dramatically increases risk and results in products that don't hit the market with any real impact. Because without the experimentation and the feedback that goes with it, it's impossible for us to do that. We have to be able to find out and refine both our solution techniques and our priorities about what problems we're trying to solve. Without this idea of experimentation, of hypothesis-based development baked into what we're doing, there's no way that we're going to be able to maximize throughput. And if we don't maximize throughput, then our competition is going to hit the market harder than we do, walk past us, and we're very rapidly going to find ourselves in an organization that has become a rudderless aristocracy. I heard someone applying that metaphor to Apple after the release of their current crop of phones, none of which seem to use this idea at all. So anyway, what do you guys think?
I think that experimentation exists down in some small groups, but once again, we're looking at the ecosystem in which those small groups live in, and there's a lot of focus on very small bits of experimentation, and maybe organizations need to take a bit more risk and have products that fail. And if they're used to failing fast, to borrow one of those trendy words, they will be able to minimize their investment in that experimentation. But, you know, we all know that the reason venture capital works is that they throw a lot of money at the wall and they're just hoping that one of them sticks. And the organizations that are most progressive and most able to adapt and survive are the ones who take those same risks. If you've only got one horse in the race, you're going to whip that horse really hard. But if you can back 100 frogs, one of those frogs might beat all those other horses that are running in the field.
Wow, that's a wonderful metaphor. I'm not entirely certain what to do with it. It sounds like Achilles and the tortoise, but I get where you're coming from. If you're only backing the one horse, well, even if it's a favorite, you're going to lose your dough 9 times out of 10. If you can have a flutter on all of them, and one of them manages to beat the odds, which startups that succeed do, well, then it makes sense to invest very broadly. I really like that the insight you've got on this one, Francis, because I hadn't really thought about this from the venture capitalist perspective, that they're not just investing in startups, they are competing with the big corporates and they're out-competing them through investing in many little startups.
Yep.
Startups as
Exactly.
Cool. So then when we are inside large organizations, this paradigm is essential as well. And of course, a lot of people listening to this will be going, yeah, you tried explaining that to my management, good luck. So this is where the Seven Samurai stuff allows us to generate new cultural fundamentals and then to prove them. So being able to do that is where we can introduce these kinds of culture changes that could never fly in the existing culture. We have to pull the organization into the new culture rather than push the culture into the existing organization. There's also an experimental process, and that's where that kind of self-propagating transformation lowers risk as well. Anything else, or should we move on?
Let's move on.
All right. The penultimate permaculture principle: use edges and value the marginal. The interface between things is where the most interesting events take place. These are often the most valuable, diverse, and productive elements of the system. The examples that Holmgren gives here have to do with the soil as an interface between the mineral world and the atmosphere, and the seashore as the interface between the land and the oceans. This is a really neat idea of using edges, but when it comes to understanding this in the realm of human organizations and corporations and markets, we had a lot of trouble with this one. It was very difficult to understand what edges meant. The marginal is easier because the examples that he gives are people who are unemployed. You should find ways for them to give and receive value in the villages and the farms that you're setting up in a permaculture context. We should be trying to enroll everyone so that we can have a richer and more diverse ecosystem. Okay, that's beautiful. But the edges part of this was really hard until we had the insight that by edge, in our context, we mean interfaces. Enrich interfaces and serve underdeveloped markets. The spaces between market segments are where most opportunities for innovation and productivity occur. So this is giving us an ability to focus on parts of the market that we are currently ignoring. The relations between the market segments may not seem to be important to your current business cases. But if you can float a new business case that gives two or more market segments a relationship that is mutually beneficial, each is benefiting the other, then you are able to channel that benefit and build a mighty ecosystem out of it. And the obvious example for this one is Uber, where they looked at the taxi ecosystem and went, hey, you know, there's a potential relationship between drivers and passengers that isn't currently part of the ecosystem. And if we can focus on that underdeveloped market, well, we've got a completely blue ocean. Now, it's not a blue ocean anymore, and obviously Uber and the other ride-sharing services have got into a stage where they have concerns that are more to do with mitigating risk than about the underdeveloped markets. But it doesn't really matter what market segments of what businesses we look at when we can find these potential markets that are the potential relationships between market segments and then exploit them. We are able to develop new kinds of value that are presently being dropped on the floor. When it comes to the interfaces, well, we gave the example of Amazon before, and obviously we could talk about Google and Apple and Facebook as well. When we can provide interfaces between people that didn't exist before, when we can find ways to develop those interfaces to enrich them, then we can generate value in ways we couldn't before. Hence, the opportunities for innovation and productivity exist in those spaces.
This was a challenging one for us to work through. Yep, absolutely. It was like you said, edges is tricky. But I think I'm very happy with this definition that we've got.
It brings to mind an old Taoist story, the one about cooked in, which I'll tell in a tiny little nutshell because I can spin these things out for a long time. Basically, this in the old days, cooks had to slaughter the animals as well as cook them, and so there was this cook who was so good at slaughtering buffaloes that he could chop one into small pieces while it was still alive, and it would fall apart in front of you without even knowing it was dead. So the emperor heard about this. Apologies to all the vegetarians I've just triggered. And sent for Cook Ding and said, well, I want to see you do this. And he pulled out his little chopper and zip, 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 zip. And the animal fell to pieces. And the king said, the emperor said, that was astonishing. I can't believe that. How did you do it? And so the cook said, well, you see, it's all about the chopper. It used to be, when I was a young cook, that I would hack away at bones and my chopper needed to be replaced every couple of months. Choppers are very expensive, particularly in ancient China. So couldn't do that. So I started to avoid the bones and just go at the ligaments and tendons. And well, that was much easier. I only had to change my chopper once every couple of years. But then I realized that between every part of everything, there are interfaces. And since these interfaces are infinitely small and the edge of the blade is infinitely sharp, it fits into them just fine. So that's how I'm able to do it. But even now, I come to parts of the animal that are unfamiliar to me. And then I have to probe very tenderly with the chopper until that part falls to bits as if I was poking at a clod of earth. And then I take my chopper, I wipe it carefully, and I put it away. So the metaphor that comes with this is of course, sort of opposing the kind of competitive politics that dominated ancient China. But when it comes to the businesses we work with, they are often in very harsh competitive relationships between the businesses, between the people in the businesses, and so it's like hacking bones. So that kind of advice to look at the interfaces, to enrich those and serve the underdeveloped markets, that applies to what's going on in the organization as an ecosystem, as well as the market as an ecosystem. I suspect that we are wasting time and I should go on. What do you think?
Want to go?
I have a feeling. All right, so I will move on. Okay, the last one. Creatively use and respond to change. We can have a positive impact on inevitable change by carefully observing and then intervening at the right time. Now, Francis and I and Senge Kanu-Kamwe, who's not on this call because it's 3 in the morning in Toronto, we had a lot of trouble with this one, not because we didn't understand the language, but because it's such a general and broad idea that turning it into something that we could measure seemed really hard. But I think we've got it there, or most of the way there. I was talking about it with Senge yesterday. Creatively embrace change. Research new ways to open current market bottlenecks and mutually beneficial channels to and between future market opportunities. Our ability to open these channels is our ability to extend the network of mutual benefit that we've been talking about. So this kind of brings the whole permaculture, the whole ecosystems thinking stuff full circle, because the kind of research we have to do will involve the close face-to-face collaboration of the business, design, and technical stakeholders, because they understand the constraints that that constitute the field of potential bottlenecks, and they understand the drivers that constitute the mutual benefit that we can extend to and between future market opportunities. Now, the idea of between future market opportunities still seems a bit nebulous, but if we start to think that a business case is about how we can construct a virtuous cycle involving many players, and we will have some part of that cycle, then the ability to open those mutual benefit channels between other market segments that aren't necessarily directly benefiting us, the pay it forward idea that Robert Heinlein championed, that winds up coming back to us. And this is where XSCALE as the Linux of the agile world, or for that matter, Linux as the Linux of the software world, that's where open source is enormously beneficial. The value that comes back to the organizations that participate in those communities is vastly greater than they could generate by themselves in a closed source or a closed book context. Guys, what do you reckon?
It's challenging. I think it was one of the things we had to work out was whether how closely we should stick with Holmgren with this one, because it's really nice. But we wanted to make sure that we actually had some impact on organizations and businesses that don't want to wait. They don't like the word carefully observing. They want to do things all the time. And finding more active language was one of the things we did to realign this one with where businesses and organizations and how they see the world.
I think that there's also a correspondence to some of the original threads of agility. The very first agile book, Kent Beck's Extreme Programming, I think was it embraced or explained? I think it was explained. Yes, right, it was explained. And the subtitle was Embrace Change. So, but a lot of the early agile stuff was embracing change in a responsive mode. Holmgren identifies two threads. The first being about responding to inevitable change, but the other thread in his explanation of this principle has to do with embracing the ability to create positive change by intervening at the right time. So the sort of passive language in this that we've tried to transcend, I'm not certain that this one is 100% right yet. I think that it's now measurable because we can measure market bottlenecks, which is good. But I think that if we think about learning flow in an organization, the bottlenecks there, we still have a bunch of work to do on metrics.
Yes, I don't think you quite captured the timeliness element of it.
I agree with you. We still have some work to do. That's okay. That's why we're doing these podcasts, is to capture feedback. And so one thing I should mention is after the last one, we had some brilliant feedback from Holmgren himself. I'm hoping that conversation is going to continue. But I really want to invite everybody who is listening to this to get in touch with us and let us know if you can find ways to improve these ideas, or if you've got ideas that we've completely off the beam in some fashion. We are taking terrible liberties with permaculture and applying it to a corporate context, because the traditional view of corporations is that they are directly opposed to the interests of biological ecosystems, and for that matter, since humans are in those biological ecosystems, to our own better interests, that there is an inherent evil to them. I think that the idea we've got in XSCALE is that those evils simply have to do with really bad Nash equilibria in a game theoretic sense. And that by changing reward models, communication structures, and leadership protocols, we can create virtuous, agile organizations. Now, there's one extra idea in there. Because we're defining an ecosystem as a network of mutual benefit, well, you can think of an organism as a network of mutual benefit. You can think of an organization as one. You can think of a market as one. And you can think of nature itself as one. So I think that what's missing here, I agree, is the timeliness aspect. We need to be able to respond to change in all of those networks. And right now, our organizations don't. So,
yeah, I think it also comes back to what we were talking about with risk as well, because of the attempt to eliminate risk, and that provokes that kind of I need to be in continual action thinking. I think, it's a hard one to get the right words, I must admit.
It is. But we have that one about experimentation that I think goes to the risk conversation. But I think your point about timeliness, though, is really good.
Yeah.
So let's consider this one as imperfect for now, and that's all good. We are going to improve it. And I think that we might next year provide an update on where we're up to with ecosystems thinking that should talk about some of the metrics that we're expecting to attach to each and every one of these principles. Now, there was one thing I wanted to do before we we get into the wrap-up for this podcast. There's a symbol that it's nice to have a sort of a summary of everything we've got so far. There's a post on LinkedIn with this stuff. But there's a symbol we've been using for ecosystems thinking. And it might seem rather curious, and I wanted to show people just a little bit about where the idea for this symbol comes from and what we mean by it. So I'll do that in a tiny little nutshell. I'm going to use the little SketchUp model that we've been using for this. Okay, so here we have what appears to be a bunch of squares and octagons and maybe irregular hexagons if you look at the sides. This is all laid out in a grid. This is kind of you can think of this as a scrum if you want to. If it was properly self-organizing, you wouldn't have that many elements, but it still gives the idea that we've got people connected together very closely, and those people have different kinds of concerns. Let me have a quick look at that.
All right, guys, I've got to go. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Mel. And thank you to all the listeners. I'm available. But please be in touch.
Thank you very much for
Peter, please continue, and I will bid you all a good night.
Beautiful. All right. See you later. Have a good night.
Bye.
Okay. So here, well, now we have the scaling problem. We have many of these little squads or scrums or whatever you want to think of them, and we have to organize them somehow. Being humans, we tend to like rectilinear things. We like the scale symmetry as well. You can sort of see that if we were to look at a group of 3 of these units, 9 of these units, they form a little square, and then we can look at having those squares in a bigger square and so on. The trouble is that human conversations are very highly dimensional. There are many, many different kinds of concerns all flowing around. And so simple tree structures, simple grid structures, matrix management, hierarchical management don't really capture the richness. And since they don't capture it, they can't channel it, we wind up with a lot of delegation going on. So if we enrich the model a bit, we add some dimensions, then we can start to see a different way to look at these relationships. I'm not trying to make snowflakes with this. These are actually truncated octahedron. When you look at them from one angle, they form a grid. When you look at them from another angle, they form rosettes of hexagons. So where things get interesting with this, I'll move past this one, is when you start to try and capture these scale symmetries and make them explicit. So if I was to take what we just looked at and then, and then look at the containment relationships, well, now we have something really interesting. Previously we had things that were very discrete. You couldn't see that there was any overall form. With this view, we have what appears to be a continuum, just as we have in nature. So it's not that we don't want to have self-organizing autonomous teams, but by aligning them into value streams, by aligning the value streams into portfolios, by aligning the portfolios into organizations and taking advantage of those scale symmetries in the way that we set up communication structures, as we did in Game Without Thrones, well, we're able to generate a richer structure where form and function are identical. But there is, in this diagram, there is also an intent for a meaning that might not be explicit. If we think of the green stuff as this is living, growing organisms in harmony in nature. And we could think of the blue stuff, or on the land anyway. We could think of the blue stuff as the oceans. We could think of the light blue stuff as the atmosphere. The yellow stuff, well, perhaps that's organisms that are decaying to be able to make mineral resources of various sorts. This pink or purpley critter here would have to be the technology realm. This is where we've got all of our machines, all the automation we've talked about. And the white stuff in the middle, well, that could be our way of understanding the function of intelligence in harmonizing all of these things. So you might wonder, well, okay, is that a complete picture? I'm not trying to do earth, air, fire, and water. I'm much more interested in using this model to understand more about how our organizations function in a natural context. And you can see that the bottom half of this model is truncated octahedra form, rosettes of about 15, and then self-similar. This is basically a fractal all the way down. This critter at the bottom, it's dark. Well, maybe that's sort of where a lot of our unsustainable, non-renewable behaviors live. And there is a dark reflection of all of these things there. I think of that as the direction of stupid. So what we're trying to do with ecosystems thinking is find a way to maintain these relationships in a mode that is going to lead us upwards towards growth out into the solar system and towards the stars. It might sound hopelessly idealistic, given we're facing climate catastrophes of various sorts, and potentially nuclear winters or solar flares or you name it. But if it wasn't for some of those catastrophes, in particular the climate threat that we're all well aware of, humanity is on the verge of a golden age created by a set of technologies that we already possess. Algaculture, which is to say, creating strains of algae for food instead of the agriculture we're used to. Algaculture, this is already something we do. We have algae we grow for food supplements right now. Algae double their biomass in less than a day. So you could put a vat of algae on your roof if you had sufficient support structure for the technology, and you could generate the biomass you might like to eat, except that algae isn't very palatable. It tastes like, well, green stuff. To tell the truth, they now have strains that are much milder, but it still doesn't taste like filet mignon and so on. Well, if you have these things, then you can start to say, we know that our human population on this planet is going to stabilize at about 11 billion and around about 2100 catastrophes notwithstanding. Well, that's only 5 billion more than today. Now, that might sound silly. Cities are already ridiculously overcrowded. How could we increase their size by another 2/3? Well, if we have algaculture matured over the next generation, we won't need all that farmland. We can spread out. We can use the renewable energy technologies we have developed. We can use augmented reality to connect to each other, and we can use 3D printing. We already have the ability to 3D print houses and all of the stuff inside them. So as these technologies mature, we will develop a liberty to improve our relationships with nature that should bring human industry into harmony with them. And that's the vision we've got with ecosystems thinking. Whether we really wind up in such a beautiful, sustainable garden paradise world where all of the farmland's been converted into little villages and we have plenty of space because, well, there's infinitely, not infinitely, but there's a huge amount more land used for farmland than we use for dwelling. Well, there's always the catastrophes. So I think maybe that's a good place to leave this. What do you think, guys?
Nice ending. Nice ending.
Mel, how about you?
Yep, that seems like the perfect place to stop.
Oh, and here I wanted to go on and on about how we can mine the asteroids and make McKendree cylinders that have the surface area internally of continents. And, well, I dare say that in our next series of XSCALE podcasts, which Stefan, you and I are intending to do a season 2 in 2019. This is the last one for 2018. We might get to play with some of those ideas.
Awesome.
In the break, we have 2 XSCALE Alliance stewards, Kumar Dattatreyan and Nishant Sasitharan. They're based in North America, and they're going to have a go at doing some XSCALE podcasts too. So you and I get to have a break, and I can't wait to hear what they produce.
Likewise. Peter, thanks a lot for all the effort you put into this. It was really a pleasure, and looking forward to continuing this in 2019, right?
Absolutely. I think that the way that we've been working so far has been a little experimental, but the way that we've got our ecosystem developing, that's something that is going to generate a lot of new ideas and a lot of new work. This is a learning ecosystem. So I can't wait for us to get more people involved, more ideas from more different folk. I think that the stuff we've started here, and for that matter, everybody in the audience, we expect this stuff is going to spread out, and we would love to get more of you involved too, whether you're in our ecosystem or other ones. We want to look at an ecosystem of ecosystems there too. And that goes to permaculture, which is where Mel's come from, and that's kind of where we are now. And so maybe we leave it there.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Stefan. Take care. See you next year, everybody.